Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest, Associate Professor and Director of African American Studies at the University of Memphis, author of this amazing new book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, Dr. Brian Kwoba. Thank you for coming through Wise the Dome TV.
Thank you so much, Rakeem, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome, man. And so before we even get started, I would like to just talk about the book overall, right? And Hubert Harrison and his importance within the Black radical tradition, within the our history as Black folks, and the history of America. So much overlap, the history of the labor movements in America,
Yep, yep.
and so I have, and there hasn't been much written about him, as you know. And so I have John G. Jackson's small book, Black Socrates.
Hmm.
Also, Jeffrey Perry's two books on Harrison. But this is the one. This is the one for us. This is the one that frames it in the context of his time and today's time as well
Yep.
within the Black radical tradition. And I'm extremely appreciative for you and this work. And so thank you.
You're welcome, man. I appreciate that. It's been a long time coming. Spent 12 years,
Mm.
on this book, and so it's a pleasure to finally put it out in the world and share what I've been doing in the woodshed for all these years.
You know, it's amazing. Not just the history, but the way it's written. It's written. It will satisfy the academics, and it'll satisfy those who are just interested in Black history, who might not be an academic. And
Hmm.
so it's it's that perfect it's that perfect I don't want to say middle ground because it doesn't seem to be giving up anything on one end, but
Hmm.
it works so well and it flows so well. And again, this is clearly head and shoulders to me the best work on Hewitt Harrison that we have. And so before we discuss Harrison himself, right, if you can't
Yes.
set the stage for us about like what was the political and cultural atmosphere of Black life when Harrison began his work.
Sure. Well, thanks again for your kind words and affirmations of the book. In terms of the context for Harrison's life, Harrison, he was born in St. Croix, what is now the U.S. part of the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1883. He moves to New York, as a teenager in 1900, and he lives the next 27 years until 1927 in New York City, most of that time being in Harlem. And so we're talking about the early 20th century, right? We're talking about the Jim Crow era, where segregation in the South is rampant, political disfranchisement, right? Black folks are denied the right to vote in the South. Lynching is a primarily Southern but national epidemic,
Mhm.
as are the anti-Black pogroms and massacres that emerge most forcefully in the Red Summer of 1919, but are also an epidemic spanning from the late 19th into the early and even mid 20th century in some cases. And so it's a time when there's extreme racial violence, white supremacist terrorism, and racial oppression of Black people. But it's also a time in which, various resistance movements are on the rise. You have, the sort of rise of the Niagara movement
Mm.
and the NAACP, which are symbolized by figures like William Monroe Trotter and W.E.B. Du Bois. You have the anti-lynching work of an Ida B. Wells. You have the beginnings of a kind of secular Black socialist politics, which Harrison is one of the pioneers of. And of course, you have the old guard of Booker T. Washington, the industrial education model at Tuskegee and Hampton and other places. And then, of course, you have a number of other folks, T. Thomas Fortune,
Mhm.
um, Johnny Bruce, Arturo Schomburg. You have the beginnings of what we might now call Black Studies.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot. There's a lot of oppression, but there's also a lot of resistance to oppression. And so Black life is in a very dynamic period at the early beginnings of the 20th century during Harrison's lifetime.
Indeed, indeed. And so when we look at this book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, and how I mentioned this one is for us within the tradition of Black radicalism, within there's so much overlap, right? As we mentioned off camera, where it's the history of Black radicalism in America, the history of America in general, the history of labor movements in general, the
Yep.
history of, you know, uh, of race consciousness
Hmm.
and fighting for the freedom, justice, and equality of our people. And so it's so much. And then again, as we talked about earlier, John G. Jackson had a small book with a yellow cover, Black Socrates, and Jeffrey Perry has two books on uh, Hubert Harrison as well. And so,
Hmm.
was this approach intentional as far as how you wrote this and the framing of Hubert Harrison was within the Black radical tradition and from you know that time till now?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I have to say, first off, is a big shout out to Jeff Perry.
Mhm. Absolutely.
May he rest in power,
Mhm,
because he laid an extraordinary foundation for scholarly study of Hubert Harrison. He has, as you mentioned, the two-volume biography of Harrison, which represents a level of detail and meticulous sophistication that only his 40 years of work
mhm,
could have produced.
mhm,
At the same time, when you have a two-volume biography totaling almost 1,200 pages, not including footnotes,
mhm.
it becomes a bit daunting for the general reader to read that much, right?
Yes.
It's great for me as a scholar. It was like a reference work for my research. Perry's narrative biography is so detailed and so it gets into the minutia that it becomes you almost lose the forest for the tree,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And so what my book tries to do, if Perry is looking at Harrison, if we liken Harrison to a tree, and Perry is looking at every single leaf and branch and piece of bark on the tree, I'm trying to place the tree within the
mhm,
forest in which it
mhm,
took root. That
mhm,
is within the larger local, national, and international contexts in which Harrison's ideas and organizations and social movements were exerting influence and contending for power at times. And so that's one difference between me and Perry. Another big one is that I'm approaching Harrison from an unapologetically Black and African angle of vision,
mhm,
given my own positionality as a person born in the U.S. of a Kenyan father and a white American mother, for whom questions of race and identity, African American identity, Kenyan identity, African identity have been really at the center of my story. And so there's a
mhm,
number of things that I can relate to in Harrison's story that I think position me well to interpret his life,
mhm,
and to bring together a more thematic approach. It's a single volume book, it's punchy, right? Each chapter covers a different theme
yes.
because I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted to write not just for scholars, but for a much more general audience, for activists, for community organizers, for teachers, right?
Mhm,
And have a work that people could really kind of get their teeth into, sink their teeth into the real meaning and significance of Hubert Harrison and the kind of multi-dimensional radicalism that he represented, and which remains supremely instructive for all of the same structural inequalities and forces that we need to resist today.
absolutely. And thinking about that history and that tradition in which Hubert Harrison existed in, and even from an African standpoint, exists in at this moment as well. Why has he been forgotten by so many? And as far as mainstream history and the telling of our story, even sometimes by folks that look like us, right? Like he's not mentioned.
Hmm.
And he was such, and we'll get into it obviously later on in the show, but we are talking about a brilliant, a brilliant human being. And
Hmm.
why has, I don't want to say he has I don't want to say he's been forgotten because we are. doing everything that we can to keep his name and legacy alive, especially with this new book. But why is he not known the way a Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey or Du Bois is known and revered within our history?
Great question. And this is an inevitable question, right?
Hmm.
Anybody who starts looking at Hubert Henry Harrison will very quickly realize, number one, this person was brilliant and influential in his time, but also we'll start to wonder, well, why haven't more people heard about him, right?
Hmm.
How has he become so marginalized in popular memory? And so, there's a number of reasons for this, and it's a bit of a complex question. So I'll try to give just kind of the basic overview,
Sure.
but the metaphor I use in the book is that Harrison represents a kind of touchstone
Mm.
for a number of different movements and historical narratives that puts them to the test and exposes their limitations, and thereby makes them not want to remember Harrison, right? So a touchstone is a hard, dark stone that you use to test the purity of metals by seeing what kind of streaks they leave behind when you rub it against the touchstone. So using that metaphor, we can take the example of the Socialist Party, right? Harrison was a pioneering black socialist, innovated, made contributions and innovations both in theory and in practice for the socialist movement. Tried to get them to take black workers more seriously, recruit black workers and organizers into the party. At some point, that became threatening to
Yes.
the moderate, middle class, and white leadership of the party, given that Harrison was a radical working class and black socialist. And so they ended up persecuting him, driving him out of the party, and thereby driving him out of the history of the Socialist Party, because the historians of the Socialist Party have so often taken their cues from the predominantly white socialists themselves, who wanted to forget and ignore and marginalize Harrison because they couldn't handle his criticisms. And this is a phenomenon which is repeated in other examples, right? We could talk about the Garvey movement, for example. Harrison played a decisive role in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism. And yet, over time, he developed some very incisive critiques of Marcus Garvey, and tried to expose some of the authoritarian behavior, some of the lies that he felt Garvey was telling the world, and for that reason, he gets ultimately shunned from not just the Garvey movement, but from the historians of the Garvey movement, who, just like Garvey himself, had an interest in marginalizing, erasing, and forgetting such a sharp and incisive and internal critic of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. One last example I'll just share quickly is this whole so-called Harlem Renaissance
Hmm.
narrative, which I have a whole chapter about, called the Renaissance School of Negro History, which, once again, Harrison is in Harlem. He's a multi-dimensional thinker, activist, organizer, journalist, and educator, a Renaissance man par excellence. But you know what he said about the Harlem so-called Negro Renaissance? He said the matter of a Negro literary Renaissance is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any. And so what he meant was not that when he says there isn't any such thing as a Negro literary Renaissance, he's not saying there isn't interesting, literary and artistic production coming out of Harlem. What he's saying is that people who are peddling this narrative trope of a Renaissance are demonstrating their ignorance of the rich tradition of literary output going back to the 1800s, all the
Yes.
way up to 1910s and 20s, when a so-called Renaissance was
Hmm.
discovered and declared largely by the white publishing industry that was seeking, non-threatening examples of Negro art and culture that they could market to white audiences and profit from, and thereby essentially erasing the more radical New Negro movement of Harrison's generation that was emerging in the immediate kind of post World War I sort of situation in this country. So Harrison exposes the limitations of the Socialist Party. He exposes the limitations of Marcus Garvey. He exposes the limitations of the Renaissance school of Negro history. And thereby, none of them wanted to remember him. None of them wanted to keep
Mm,
his memory alive. It was left up to Harlem community residents who did their best. Reverend Ethelred Brown, for example, renamed his Harlem Unitarian Church the Hubert Harrison
yes.
Memorial Church as a way to try to keep Harrison's memory alive, knowing that none of the powers that be, or even the oppositional forces to the powers that be, that benefited from Harrison's contributions, none of them sought to remember Harrison for their own reasons. So community residents had to try to do so. But of course, community residents can only do so much given the larger structural forces that ultimately shape which historical narratives get remembered and which ones don't.
Right. And you're doing an amazing job, did an amazing job of bringing that to light, and for a new generation. And it's extremely important. And one thing that I loved learning in this book
Mhm.
is, you know, we look at the philosophies of people like Kant and Hegel and this idea that Africa had no history and,
Mm.
slavery brought us into history. And,
Mhm.
but Harrison at the time is like, hey, I'm an untamable African.
Mhm. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
can you just expound on that and give, I guess, the people the context again of the time in which he's saying it, because
Yep.
Africa is seen as this dark continent with
Yep.
nothing going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, in 1906, just so people really understand how profound it was for him to identify that way at that time. In 1906, the Bronx Zoo in New York placed a Congolese man, Otabanga, in the monkey house
Mm,
section of the zoo, as if to say, here's an interesting creature that we're going to put on display alongside the other animals, right? Harrison, meanwhile, right next door in Harlem, is identifying as an untamed, untamable African. And, it speaks to his defiance of the kind of anti-African racism of the day, that he would embrace his African identity and roots, and frankly, developed a very groundbreaking political relationship through that identity to Africans and the continent of Africa, in which he said basically, look, all these people are talking about colonizing Africa, not only white colonizers and Europeans like Cecil Rhodes and Rudyard Kipling and so on, who depict Africans as savage, backwards, and in need of Christian civilization,
mhm.
so-called. But even a lot of black figures at the time are reproducing some of the stereotypes and colonial mentalities
Yes.
of European society, which said, for example, you have Martin Delany in the 19th century who coined the slogan famously "Africa for the Africans." But what people forget is the other part of that slogan: Africa for the Africans and black men to rule them.
Mm,
This idea that more advanced, quote unquote, black folks from the diaspora
mhm.
needed to go to Africa to help uplift and civilize the natives who lacked development or who lacked civilizations of their own. Harrison turns this colonial logic on its head, and he says the task of black folks in the diaspora is not to teach, but to learn from
Mm,
Africans because they have so much to teach us,
mm,
right? And so he develops what I call a radical humility towards Africa and Africans. He studies deeply African history, right? He's talking about ancient Egypt. He's talking about ancient Mali and Songhai and Great Zimbabwe. He's talking about the ancient African civilizations that produced a whole number of achievements in terms of their politics, in terms of their technology, in terms of culture, right? And he is essentially saying, look, we shouldn't pretend to be worried about the political welfare of Africans if we know nothing about them. And so he called on folks to learn about Africa, to learn why it was that European colonial powers were so interested in Africa, in the resources, in the minerals, in the labor of Africans. So much so that it actually produced a world war, World War One, what Harrison called the White World War, which was essentially an inter-imperialist conflict over who would rule the lands of the darker races of the world, including the African continent. right? So Harrison is a staunch anti-colonialist, but also someone who believes that African redemption is going to needs to come from within Africa, not from some benevolent outsiders, whether white or black.
Mm. And again, everybody, this is why you need to make sure you go out and get this book. And the link will definitely be in the description. Very powerful stuff from a powerful figure in our history. Now, we talk about his time within the Socialist Party of America, um, and we look at labor repression from 1881, 1905. There were 38,303 strikes. This class consciousness that Hubert Harrison has, is that more of a product of his time, and and how, I guess, widespread the labor movement was? Like, I guess I'm trying to ask, where did this class consciousness come from?
Great question. Well, I think Harrison's class consciousness began on St. Croix, where he
Mm,
was born and raised, because he was the son of, plantation workers. He himself had a working class, very humble background, and he was born just 4 years after the Great Fireburn Rebellion, which was a general strike on the island of St. Croix against the Danish colonizers. And so his parents lived through that moment, and Harrison certainly, coming from humble origins, always identified with the people, with the grassroots. So when he gets to New York as a teenager, he gets exposed to a number of ideological and political movements that are very cutting edge for their day, one of which was the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world. Because just like today we have the billionaire oligarchs in power, right? In Harrison's day, they had their billionaire oligarchs, what they called the robber barons of the Gilded Age, right?
mhm,
J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, folks who ruled over entire monopolies within the oil industry or the banking industry, and things of that nature. And so there was extreme inequality, wealth inequality, but also, extreme exploitation of working people, of sharecroppers, of convict laborers, of steel workers, of a whole number of different working sectors of the U.S. working class. And this extreme inequality and exploitation produced, it gave huge impetus and momentum for the Socialist Party to grow, for the industrial workers of the world, a radical labor union to grow. And so Harrison is witnessing all of this, and when Harrison actually, which was unusual for a black immigrant at the time, he was able to secure employment as a postal worker because of his brilliance and
mhm,
passing the test, with flying colors. But he loses his job as a postal worker due to criticizing Booker T. Washington and the response from the Tuskegee machine, right, which was a mechanism by which Booker T. Washington was able to police the acceptable boundaries of black political thought in this country until he was kind of challenged by the Niagara movement,
mhm,
W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, and a number of other folks, also in the NAACP, who would challenge Booker T. Washington's hegemony. But in any case, Harrison, essentially is a man of, by, and for the people, and so he's interested in working class liberation because he himself is a worker. He identifies with the working class. He has no shame about that, right? He wonders what his life might have been like if he wasn't, born that way. But he's grateful that it keeps him grounded and it
mhm.
keeps him connected to the grassroots.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing that just in reading the book and within socialist circles today, even today, you can find people that will deny that race is an issue, and they'll call you out for dealing in identity politics and things of that nature. And
Yeah.
there was a quote, I can't remember who said it, but in the book you mentioned it, where they said is I'm paraphrasing here, but like there is no Negro question outside the class question, right?
Yes, yes.
And again, I see that in some leftist circles today.
Yep.
But can you talk about that dynamic for people who, again, who may not be familiar with, what I guess what socialist movements, um, what they're founded on, and also, again, because this led to Harrison leaving the SPA. And
Yeah.
so, if you can talk about the lack of race consciousness within the SPA that made Harrison finally be like, "Hey, I gotta go."
Absolutely. Well, the Socialist Party of America, it was a massively and rapidly growing force in the early 1900s, in the first, 2 decades essentially of the 20th century. And Eugene Debs becomes the most popular socialist in the country. He's the perennial presidential candidate of the Socialist Party. And in 1912, he wins 6% of the vote running for president, the highest number that a socialist candidate has ever gotten in this country. Um, I'll come back to Debs in a second because he's such an instructive figure. But the Socialist Party, much like the Democratic Socialists of America today, had different factions and different tendencies within it. On the one hand, you had a more moderate and reformist faction of the Socialist Party, which saw socialism as coming about through winning more socialist candidates to political office and gradually legislating from above socialist policies. And then you had a more radical or left-wing faction of the Socialist Party, which supported general strikes and organizing workers at the point of production and more revolutionary ideas about workers seizing the means of production and reorganizing society from below in their own class interest, a kind of Marxian view of the struggle for and path to socialism. And Harrison was certainly on the left wing of the party. He supported, a number of sort of more radical positions, industrial organizing, like the IWW was fighting for, the general strike, sabotage, right? Workers actually deliberately undermining production in order to get their demands. And when it comes to race politics, as you can imagine, the party had many different conflicting positions. You had some socialists who were openly racist, who supported lynching as a legitimate means of dealing with the supposed sexual threat, quote unquote, that
Hmm.
black men pose to white women and white masculinity. And then you had socialists like Eugene Debs who opposed racism and but even a radical like Debs, who was talking about, you know, he's talking about a vision of socialism in which workers actually seize the means of production, abolish capitalism and wage slavery, and enfranchise, women and people regardless of race, color, creed, or nationality. Even Debs had his great limitations when it came to his racial politics. And this is something that a lot of white leftists don't like to discuss or like to defend, like to sort of explain away, which
Hmm.
I just don't think is helpful. We need to be honest about the fact that Debs said, the class struggle is colorless, and therefore we have nothing special as a party to offer African Americans. He said we can't make separate appeals to all the races. And so basically, black folks should join the Socialist Party
Hmm.
because it's going to solve their problems on a class basis as workers. Now, what's problematic about this is that, as people like you and I can see, obviously, um, there was a very specific and special form of oppression that black workers faced.
Hmm.
I'm talking about Jim Crow segregation. I'm talking about disfranchisement, right? The rampant sexual violence against black women, the weekly lynchings of black men. You had entire African American towns like Oscarville, Georgia, and Coahuila, Alabama, that were directly and permanently submerged underwater by the white supremacist society of this country. And it's amazing that even the quote unquote radical Debs says, well, party has nothing special to offer about all of that. And so this is where Harrison comes in because he's bringing a distinctively and intentionally black angle of vision
Yes.
to socialism, right?
Hmm.
He's the first black party member to write a whole series on the Negro and socialism, explaining the dialectical relationship between race and class in US history and the fact that the Socialist Party had a duty to champion the cause of the Negro as part of building a working class movement in this country that is worthy of the name.
Hmm.
Harrison pointed out, for example, that black folks at that time were the most thoroughly proletarian element in the country, right? The most thoroughly working class element in the country, and the most thoroughly exploited sector of the working class. And so if you're a part of a party that sees itself as standing for and fighting for the emancipation of the proletariat,
Hmm.
you would think that they would put the most thoroughly proletarian and most thoroughly exploited part of the proletariat at the center of their theory and practice, which is exactly what the majority white Socialist Party did not do. And when Harrison founded and led and spearheaded the first official black-led party formation, that is the Colored Socialist Club in Harlem, in order to recruit black workers and organizers to the party, he very quickly was seen as a threat. And to make a longer story short, the moderate white and middle class party leadership ended up persecuting the radical working class and black Hubert Harrison to the point where they drove him out of the party. And he ended up, basically concluding that black folks needed to put race first in their political concerns, black racial solidarity first, because the so-called class first socialists were themselves actually putting the white race first
Yes. Yes.
above their supposed commitment and investment in class solidarity and class consciousness. Because if you're going to put a little asterisk by black communities when you claim to be supporting class solidarity and class consciousness, you're leaving out a key sector of the working class, which will be used against you as it was at the time, right? Black workers were often brought in to break the strikes of white workers and to deliberately foment racial divisions that only supported the capitalist class, and kept workers divided from each other along racial lines.
You mentioned in the book, and you've also mentioned a little bit during this interview, when we talk about the robber barons, J.P. Morgans, the Carnegies, and
Uh-huh.
Rockefellers,
Mhm.
and we talk about the Booker T. Washington machine, right?
Yes.
And how uh, white quote unquote philanthropy um, funded Booker T. Washington's machine and the push for the Hampton Tuskegee idea of education, which in turn fattens the pockets of those robber barons because of the industries in which they have monopolized. We're just going to fund
Hmm.
black education to create more workers,
Hmm.
and we'll continue to exploit their labor and get rich.
Hmm.
Hubert
Yeah.
Harrison was not afraid to critique Booker T. Washington when it comes to, I guess, I guess this whole idea, his idea of education and the machine that he had around him. What was Harrison's thoughts on the Booker T. Washington and the Booker T. Washington machine?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mentioned a moment ago that Harrison was fired from his postal job because of his criticisms of Washington. But Harrison also, criticized the model of education, as you said, that Washington represented. If I can quote, from page 18, my introduction, he says, Harrison says, basically he's saying that money, most of the capitalist philanthropy is going to what he called the labor caste schools. Why? Because the dark degradation of the Negro must be lightened by no ray of learning. That would never do. We
Mm,
need them as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And
mm,
in the meanwhile, this is what the richest country on earth offers to ruthlessly exploited people as a training for life. He was denouncing the fact that in the southern states, black folks made up 40% of the population, but received only 14% of state funds allocated for education, and how basically the white capitalists were supporting industrial education for black folks because it kept them docile and subservient and in a kind of trade school level of education where they would just become workers in the cogs of the capitalist machine without the kind of training for higher level thinking, for higher level and more militant kind of political awareness and social awareness of the kind that he was promoting through his what Harlem residents called the outdoor university,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
Harrison developed an entire pedagogical method that was different not only from the industrial education of the Tuskegee institutes of the world, but also stood in stark contrast to the so-called higher education of the liberal arts tradition that the Harvard trained W.E.B. Du Bois and others within the so-called talented 10th represented, right? Because Harrison was speaking on street corners to
Yes.
audiences large enough to block traffic on a whole range of subjects that were never even covered or discussed in universities or industrial schools or frankly anywhere else.
Hmm.
Harrison spoke about ancient African civilizations, for example. He spoke about the free love movement and efforts to achieve erotic liberation. He spoke about global geopolitics. He spoke about anthropology and sociology. Right? He's speaking about Black arts and culture and many of the artists, the writers and poets that are emerging in Harlem and in else other parts of the country. He had a wide-ranging intellect. People described him as being a walking encyclopedia. And he was very clear about the fact that people who understood or had learning needed to come down from their Sinais, right? Come down from the ivory towers and give the knowledge to the people, because ultimately it's the common people, the working class, the grassroots who needed that knowledge in order to get free. Otherwise, it would remain cloistered within the universities and only available to a select few, or it would just be an education fitting Black folks for a life of laboring under white dominated industries like the industrial education model basically was preparing them to do, which is why the robber baron oligarchs of the day supported industrial education. It's why colonial powers like Britain and Germany saw value in the Tuskegee Institute and employed Tuskegeans in their colonization of places like Togo and South Africa, and other places to stabilize European colonial rule over Black Africans. So there's a global dimension to what's happening in this moment, and Harrison is a unique sort of alternative to some of the false dichotomies, right, between Washington and Du Bois, for example, which is so often taught in our history textbooks as though it's a boxing match and you got to pick one or the other and root for, it's
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
it's like a cartoon version of Black history that ignores the vast range and spectrum of options available for Black leadership, including figures like Ida B. Wells,
Yes.
who forged an anti-lynching movement, was spearheading the anti-lynching movement, something that neither Du Bois nor Washington were really doing in the early 1900s. And then so many other examples, including Harrison, that have just been kind of written out of the story.
Do you think that, you know, as we read in this book, and w- we know just from studying, obviously, that there were intellectual differences, with Du Bois and Washington, Ida B. Wells in Washington, Trotter in Washington. Then there were
Mhm.
issues, ideologically with Garvey and Harrison and Garvey and Du Bois. Do you think sometimes that people forget that we were literally 40 and 50 years removed from emancipation into, after the Reconstruction era, into another system of slavery with, sharecropping and
Yep.
and all of this. And so we are working out our ideas in real time. Do you think a lot of that context is missing sometimes whenever people, like they'll take a side, right? They'll say, "Hey,
Mm.
I'm Team Du Bois over Washington, or I'm Team Washington over Du Bois." Do
Uh-huh.
you think that people kind of lose sight of that?
Absolutely. Not only they lose sight of that we were working things out, as you put it, but that we were doing so in a context shaped and almost overdetermined by, capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism.
Mm,
I mean, take the Du Bois Washington sort of divide, for example. Washington's Tuskegee Institute was funded by some of the robber barons like Andrew Carnegie and others, which obviously, if, as journalists always ask, follow the money. If you want to
yeah.
understand something, follow the money, and that will tell you a lot about why and how something is happening.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, the NAACP was founded by elite white liberals.
Mm,
I think
right.
that's something that people don't appreciate enough. So I want to say it one more time. The NAACP was founded, framed, funded by elite white liberals
Mm,
who,
mhm,
might have shed a tear for the poor Negroes, but were ultimately deploying an ideology that is the talented 10th ideology,
mhm,
which emerged from the American Home Baptist Missionary Society, a
mm,
Rockefeller-funded organization,
mm,
which saw the utility in elevating a black managerial class, the so-called talented 10th, as a strategy for racial management, right? For keeping black communities within the sort of acceptable boundaries and position in life that they wanted. And so Harrison, saw the need, as he put it, for a black organization that was more radical than the NAACP, that would not rely on, a talented tenth of elite blacks to quote unquote lead the race. And instead, he said, we need to go at the problem from the other end, from the bottom up, from the
yes.
grassroots up, from the common people to collective liberation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I want to kind of stay on because one thing, again, this is why this book is so important, right? Because of your ability to frame it within our tradition and our history. And one thing that, again, having read Perry's and work on Harrison, I don't think I've never read anything, I've never read this framing here until I've read this book,
Yeah,
was whenever he began to speak about, because all right, so even during the more liberal arts type schools, right, that didn't follow the um Hampton Tuskegee model, you know it was seen to be something to learn things like Greek and things like that. And Hubert Harrison is sitting here talking about, nah, like, are these HBCUs need to be teaching African languages and African customs and Black
yep,
history.
yep,
Like, he's having a vision for Africana studies
yep,
50 something, 40 something years before it actually existed. And I thought that was
yep.
just a powerful idea. And it also speaks a lot to how much of a visionary and amazing thinker Hubert Harrison was. But whenever you think about, as somebody who is um, an Africana studies professor, and just him thinking that then in a time where, again, it is seen as, you know, um, a thing to learn Greek and learn French and learn, uh, even the ideas, right?
Latin.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Latin. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Hmm.
And as David Walker said, like, we are to be a people of inquiry. And so this idea, and of even Du Bois, talks about being men of ideas. But if these ideas are still mostly European, right,
Right,
we're still trapped in his worldview.
right.
But Hubert Harrison is like, nah, we need to learn Black history, African languages. Can you just talk about that some? Because I think that's just a very powerful sentiment, especially for that time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean Harrison, one of the organizations that he gets involved with, just as it's forming, is the Negro Society for Historical Research. This was an organization founded by Arturo Schomburg
Mm,
and John Edward Bruce, who are basically creating an organization to do Black studies outside of the formal academy, given that neither in the industrial education schools nor in the liberal arts, the Harvards, where people like William Monroe Trotter and W.E.B. Du Bois were educated, had anything remotely close to Black studies at the time. So Schomburg, of course, is an extraordinary collector of books and artifacts relating to people of African descent. And Harrison, is learning from these mentor figures who are doing a deep study, again, outside the academy because there was no space for it at the time, of Black people, of what we now think of as Africana studies. Harrison teaches a course at NYU in 1926, which was the first course ever taught at that institution with a majority Black syllabus,
mm,
right? Black
mhm.
authors and thinkers on the syllabus. In other words, he was doing even inside the academy, at least in NYU, he was doing a form of what we would later think of as Black studies, decades before the actual sort of emergence of Black studies in the 1960s in particular, to which Harrison also had a kind of served as an ancestor, right? When
Yes.
you think of people like John Henrik Clarke, for example, who's a leading figure in the movement for Black studies in the 60s, John Henrik Clarke comes out of a Harlem training, right? Was influenced by people like Hubert Henry Harrison, J.A. Rogers, John G. Jackson, right? Schomburg, and some of these folks. And so Harrison is an ancestor of Black studies, but he's also a practitioner of Black
Mhm.
studies, not to mention all the street corner speaking that he did on African cultures and colonialism in Africa and ancient African civilizations, right? And Black psychology, right? I mean, Harrison is doing things that were just way ahead of his time, and in some ways, frankly, still ahead of ours.
Yes. Yeah. One of those things is his critique on religion. And,
Uh-huh.
you know, he, you talked about him reading Thomas Paine's Age of Reason,
Yep.
and that had a profound effect on him as far as how he began to view religion. And even though I think, like you mentioned, he still liked some of the ritual aspects of things like Catholicism, right? But he would, but the religion itself and is just a no for him. Can
Hmm.
you? And he critiqued obviously the black church, and
Hmm.
but for a black intellectual then in his era, what kind of repercussions were there to, outwardly dissing religion like that?
Yeah, well, this is another fascinating and unique dimension of Harrison's radicalism, right? That very early on, around 1908, if not earlier, he breaks from Christianity, breaks from religion entirely, despite his upbringing in St. Croix, in the Anglican Church. And so he writes this letter to his mentor, Francis Reynold Keyser, in 1908, where he says, I'm an agnostic, not a dogmatic disbeliever, nor a bumptious and narrow infidel. Agnosticism simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe. And so it's basically he becomes a part of what was called the free thought movement. And the free thought movement put out publications like the Truth Seeker magazine. And freethinkers stood for the taxation of church property. Harrison writes a front page article for the Truth Seeker about how church property in New York, which was worth $400 million, was evading the payment of taxes.
Yeah.
They supported the uh, getting chaplains out of the military, getting prayers out of school, getting Bibles out of the courtroom. Basically, a complete separation of church and state, because they felt that the influence of religion and Christianity on the state and on government was wrong. That
Mhm,
religion should be a private matter.
mhm.
There's a whole history of, free thinkers and the deists going back to the Enlightenment, figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Volney. But what Harrison is adding to the mix, this is a joke I make oftentimes in my book talks, is that everything gets better when you blacken it. Right, right.
Right.
So Marxism gets better when you blacken it. Feminism gets better when you blacken it. Free thinking gets better when you blacken it. So Harrison is a pioneering black free thinker, and he writes, for example, quote, "It should seem that Negroes of all Americans would be found in the free thought fold, since they have suffered more than any other class of Americans from the dubious blessings of Christianity. Yet the church among Negroes today exerts a more powerful influence than anything else in the sphere of ideas."
Mm,
Um, he goes on to say the church saw to it that the religion taught to slaves should stress the servile virtues of subservience and content, and these things have bitten deeply into the souls of black folk. He's riffing a little bit on this
yeah.
on the Du Bois book there, but basically this idea, what he was trying to explain was he was arguing that black communities were so conservative, generally speaking, in this country, because, as he put it, Christianity still enslaves the minds of those whose bodies it had long held bound.
Mm.
Right. And so Harrison emerges as the most prominent black free thinker of his generation. There were others, that would come after him, particularly Black socialist and communist thinkers, some of the folks associated with the so-called Harlem Renaissance. But the point is that this is an extraordinary thing, given the predominance and hegemonic role that the church was playing in Black communities, and in particular, as Harrison argued, exerting a conservative influence
Mm.
that mitigated against Black folks joining radical labor unions or socialist or communist parties or some of the more forward-thinking, and revolutionary movements and organizations of the day.
Hubert Harrison was also in the beginning an editor for the Negro World,
Yes,
which is Marcus Garvey's newspaper in the
yes,
for the UNIA.
yes,
Can you talk a little bit about their relationship and then their ideological differences?
absolutely. So, this is a fascinating subject. I have two whole book chapters on the relationship between Harrison and Garvey and Garveyism, because Harrison has the unique distinction of being, on the one hand, Garvey's greatest catalyst
Hmm.
and also his most incisive critic.
Mm.
So I'll take them one at a time. First of
Okay.
all, Harrison plays a decisive role catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism, right? Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood's initial plan when they founded the UNIA in Jamaica was to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. So Garvey's writing letters to Booker T. Washington seeking financial support and moral support for this project. In 1917, when Garvey gets to Harlem and he's down and out, he's run out of money, he ends up joining Hubert Harrison's Liberty League of Negro Americans, which is not seeking, to build an industrial school, but is talking about a mass movement for self-empowerment of Black people. That is talking about a Africa first or race first doctrine that develops an internationalist perspective, supporting the struggles of oppressed people all around the world. And these are some of the elements that Harrison taught Garvey. Harrison taught Garvey race first.
Wow.
We think of Garveyism summed up in that phrase, right? Race
Yes.
first. Harrison taught that doctrine to Garvey. And it's Garvey's time in the Liberty League that allowed him to incorporate some of the elements from the Liberty League as he was reimagining the possibilities for the UNIA. And ultimately, to his credit, turning the UNIA from a Tuskegee building operation to the largest international organization of African people that we have ever seen.
Yes.
That is almost unthinkable without the decisive role of Harrison and the Liberty League. And so Harrison has a massive impact on the rise of Garvey and Garveyism in that way. At the same time, as Garvey's star is rising, and the UNIA is emerging as this mass movement, almost out of the ashes of the Liberty League, or out of the kind of like a phoenix emerging from the ashes. Um, it gets so large and so powerful that Garvey needs some help. So he ends up tapping Harrison to edit the Negro World newspaper, as you said, the newspaper of the Garvey movement. Harrison completely redesigns the paper, fashions it into what it ultimately becomes, the most popular paper of the African diaspora throughout the world. And Harrison is observing Garvey up close, right, in the Negro World offices, in UNIA meetings, and in other settings at the First International Convention of the UNIA in August of 1920. And Harrison very quickly is developing a number of misgivings and criticisms of Garvey's leadership and behavior. Harrison, for example, doesn't like the authoritarian behavior that Garvey is exerting within the organization, right? Trying to control who gets elected to different positions at the annual convention in 1920. Garvey's massive ego, where Harrison feels like Garvey doesn't want anybody in the organization who is smarter or more influential in the community. Garvey wants to be the big cheese, right? He wants to be the HNIC. This is a case study in the why that kind of politics is problematic, and there's a whole number of issues that Harrison is chafing about with Garvey. Garvey, for example, is not taking up the question of lynching in any systematic way. Garvey is trying to build, as Garvey himself said, a black empire over which the sun shall shine as ceaselessly as it shines on the empire of the North today, right? Harrison, by contrast, is an anti-imperialist. He's not
Mhm.
he's not supporting the idea of building a black empire, but of building a colored international, which Harrison envisions as an international alliance of the colonized peoples of the world to fight against capitalist imperialism, which is the enemy that exploited the darker races for its own financial purposes. So there's all these ways, that Harrison can see the conservative, imperialistic, authoritarian, capitalistic mentality of Marcus Garvey, and how that's not actually going to liberate Black folks collectively, not working class Black folks in any case. And so Harrison becomes a critic of Garvey, but he doesn't just leave the organization and throw stones from the outside. He actually tries to push the Garvey movement in a different direction. He tries to make it more class conscious, right? He gets together some of the Black communists in Harlem to talk about, can we make the Garvey movement more class conscious? He tries to push the Garvey movement in an anti-imperialist direction. He writes that article about the Colored International. He asks questions in the Negro world like, what are we going to do about Haiti, given that Haiti was occupied by U.S. imperialism at that time,
Mhm.
right? And Harrison is also trying to push the Garvey movement in the direction of political party building. He's like, look, if we're for race first, and we want to have black owned businesses and black owned establishments and a black owned newspaper and all this, why not have a black political party? And so he founds the Liberty Party, right, which is only the second example in US history of an all black political party that they used to try and contest the 1920 election, running Reverend James Eason, a very popular Garvey movement preacher, as their
Mhm.
presidential candidate. And so, yeah, I have two chapters about this because I think what happens, right, oftentimes is that Garvey is a very polarizing figure. You have black leftists, right, socialist communists, who I think are dismissive, too dismissive of Garvey and Garveyism, and not realizing the extraordinary impact that Garveyism had on an entire generation of African nationalists, people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and of
Oh yeah,
course,
absolutely.
Malcolm X's
Hmm.
parents, right? Both Malcolm's father, Earl Little, and his mother, Louise Langdon Little, were active members of the Garvey movement in Michigan. So Malcolm X was reared in a Garveyist household. I think we can't underestimate the massive impact that Garveyism had on a whole generation of black nationalists, right? On the other hand, you have people who are staunch Garveyists, right? Who think that Garvey never did a crooked thing in his life. Harrison offers, a bit of a different perspective to them as well. because Harrison, as I said, had all these critiques of Garvey, but also tried to push the Garvey movement in a more radical direction from within. And that's what's different about Harrison's critiques of Garvey. Unlike a Du Bois, who was criticizing Garvey from outside the UNIA,
Yeah.
or an A. Philip Randolph or a Cyril Briggs, who are outside the UNIA.
Hmm.
Harrison is inside he's a dues paying member of the UNIA. He's editor of the Negro World. So his criticisms hit harder because they're internal, right? And because Harrison himself was such a titanic figure within the Harlem milieu, you have to take him seriously.
Indeed, indeed. And as again, as we mentioned, he was an editor of the Negro World. And I believe in the book you mentioned that even whenever he was editor, right, wasn't he trying to push a more anti-imperialist message with the
Hmm.
paper? And
Absolutely.
one picture I kind of want you to paint for the audience. So Hubert Harrison had the voice. Um, you know, um, we Du Bois in the Crisis, and we had the Negro World. We had all of these different black newspapers, right?
Yeah.
Um, I guess it's a two-part question.
Okay.
Can you talk to the people about the importance of black newspapers as far as getting the message out and whatever the message of the, writers and editors of these papers were at the time? And also,
Hmm.
one thing that I found very, very interesting and fascinating at that time, you mentioned that what separated Harrison's newspaper, The Voice, is that he refused ads for stuff like hair straighteners and
Hmm.
bleaching creams,
Hmm.
unlike their rivals. And so it gave me kind of a mental picture of, okay, you might have, let's say, the crisis, and you're reading about, something that's happening with black folks, let's say in Chicago or Pittsburgh or something, and then you flip the page and you see a big ad about bleaching your skin. And
Hmm.
Harrison at that time was so principled that he was like, no, I'm not accepting ads for this kind of thing. Can you just talk about that some?
Absolutely, yeah. So, one of the things that's happening in this period is Black literacy is increasing as Black folks are migrating north, right? There's the so-called Great Migration. African Americans from the South are, migrating, fleeing the terrorism of Jim Crow for greener pastures as they see them, at least, or as they hope they'll encounter in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and so on. And so this creates a new market for black newspapers. So you have, William Monroe Trotter's Guardian
Mm,
newspaper that emerges in 1903. You have papers like the Amsterdam News in Harlem, the Chicago Defender in Chicago, the Pittsburgh Courier in Pittsburgh, the Washington Bee, in DC. Um, and a lot of these papers are reliant on ad revenue from wealthy sources,
mhm,
and that limits what they can do editorially. I mean, the most egregious example of this is the New York Age, which was a paper that Booker T. Washington ends up taking over and really using to steer a conservative editorial line with its editor Fred Moore. And so Harrison founds The Voice newspaper in 1917 as alongside the Liberty League, which I mentioned earlier, as a paper that's a kind of radical black paper, right? That's not going to sort of conduct itself hat in hand in a way um, that some of the other publications at the time were doing. I should mention also Du Bois at the Crisis, right?
mhm.
The NAACP magazine, which Du Bois was editor of in the 1910s and 20s and so on. And Harrison's voice ends up basically sparking a whole new era of radical black journalism
Mm,
because after The Voice in 1917, you have The Messenger of A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, a black socialist newspaper that emerges in the wake of Harrison's voice. You have Garvey's Negro World, which emerges in 1918, the paper of the Garvey movement. You have Cyril Briggs, right, with The Crusader. that emerges in 1919, a kind of radical Black internationalist newspaper. And so there's all these other radical papers that follow in the wake of Harrison's voice and his example of a new era, a new kind of post-World War I era where there's a political awakening going on around the world, right? I mean, this is another key aspect of Harrison's life is he lived in a time of world revolution.
Mm. Right. Right.
You have the Russian Revolution that pops off. You have upheavals all throughout Europe and throughout the colonized world. You have in this country, the United States, you have a general strike in Seattle in 1919, in which workers essentially take over the city of Seattle and begin running it in their own interest. So it's a revolutionary moment, and there's a lot of appetite and thirst for more radical ideas and perspectives on the world. And Harrison is able to really step into that moment and provide a kind of example of what was possible in this new era of radical Black journalism.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome, right? Because I often look at like even what we're doing now, having this conversation on a podcast, and in 2025,
Hmm.
there are a lot of people who, use these forms of media to get the word out about certain things. And as you know, some are on, there's some are more radical than others, right? And
Right,
and
right.
when we look back at in those times, uh, and just being able to, again, like you mentioned, literacy rates are getting better, and also I think it just goes to show too, just how our people have always valued education. It was outlawed from us, right? Like we
Hmm.
had,
Hmm.
like during the times of slavery, the uh, how it was outlawed, but we would still, have the one that could read go. We'd meet him in the dark somewhere and have
Hmm.
these late night lessons, and even I believe what Carter G. Woodson wrote about, history of Black education, pre-emancipation, right? And so that kind of
Hmm.
lets you know, and then you just to see it gradually, you know, our literacy rates getting high, and then so we are again organizing our ideas. We are in the context of what's happening in the world, as you mentioned, Russian Revolution in 1917, and that has a
Hmm.
big impact on a lot of a lot of the radicalism that is going on in America, and even obviously Hubert Harrison himself. And so I just wanted you to frame that, and I appreciate um, you doing so. And so I guess one last question that I would like to ask, and I think it's and I want everybody to know and understand that even though we've gotten into depth on a lot of different things in regard to Hubert Harrison, it doesn't scratch the surface of what you'll learn in this book. So don't think this interview is a replacement for getting the book and reading it. It's so much more, and he gives you the total picture. And just trust me, make sure you go out and get that.
Hmm.
But one thing that was very interesting, right? This idea of uh, speaking on the Harlem corner, right?
Hmm.
Um, I remember I interviewed um, Mae Jackson of SNCC, and she would talk about being in Harlem as a little girl and getting off the bus and seeing Malcolm on the rostrum speaking, and how to them, right, seeing him, he was like larger than life, like a celebrity type figure, right? And so when we think about before then, the time of uh, Hubert Harrison, and how much of a dynamic speaker he was, and he would teach on the corner, and this idea of the griot in West Africa, and
Hmm.
the grioversity, the merging of two
Yes.
an African and European educational system, and he's doing all of this, and sometimes he's
Mm.
speaking for hours, like 6 and 7 hours, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I don't know if people understand how difficult that is, and he's going over a wide range of
Hmm.
topics.
Hmm.
And one interesting thing that you mentioned, it was like, look, it had the atmosphere of, and ironically speaking, because this is in Harlem as well, right? But the Showtime at the Apollo,
Mm.
like if you didn't have the juice, you would get booed
Hmm.
out. You would get booed off the
Yep.
stage, right?
Yep.
Um, and so if you can just break down the idea of the grioversity and how dynamic of a speaker Hubert Harrison was.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, um, Harlem residents described the sort of culture of street corner speaking that Harrison pioneered in many ways as the outdoor university. And I thought that was an interesting formulation because, it sort of speaks to the fact that A, it was outdoors, and B, that it was a very high level of knowledge and learning that was being shared and discussed, not just by Harrison, but by, all of the kind of street corner orators and speakers who would get up on a stepladder, literally on the corner, let's say, of 135th Street in Lenox, and a number of other locations, and literally speak to the people, right, and educate the people, and engage in a kind of collective, cooperative call and response process of uh, co-creation and processing of world events and cultural developments and ideas and ideologies. And so I said, well, this is not only a European-ish thing, like this is an African thing, actually. Call and
Hmm.
response, the oral tradition, it reminds us of the griot, the
Hmm.
West African figure of the historian slash poet slash storyteller slash wisdom keeper slash orator, who's combining all these roles for the community and providing something that is specific to the community, right? And so I call chapter 3 the outdoor grioversity because it did combine elements of, kind of university type of learning in terms of the level of study and the rigor of scholarship with a West African kind of griot-like oral tradition of call and response and active and participatory co-creation of knowledge for and of and by the community. It's a radical model of education that, again, stood in stark contrast to everything else that was available, right? And it was
Hmm.
free.
Yeah.
It was not only free financially, because, working class folks getting off the subway could come and hear a lecture about evolution or about, labor economics and Marxism, or about free love and sexual liberation. But it was also free in that sense ideologically, right? It wasn't confined by the kind of parameters and boundaries of the church or of the school system or of the media or of the industrial education model or of the liberal arts classroom. The subject matter was very wide ranging, and Harrison had a very wide ranging and encyclopedic level of knowledge. And so they covered anything and everything under the sun
Yeah.
in the outdoor grioversity. And I think, that's why I devoted a whole chapter to it, because it's just such a distinctive, for that time and that place, it's such a distinctive kind of feature of community life at a time when there was no internet, there was no
Hmm.
television,
Hmm.
right? Even radio was mostly white programming, apart from maybe one or two blackface type radio programs, right? So, in other words, social life was not lived on screens or at home, but outside in the street, right? On the corner, on the stoop. And Black folks, leaned into that with this whole culture of street corner speaking that Harrison does so much to blaze a trail for.
Absolutely. And the title of this book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, the genius part is not hyperbole. And you will see that once you get this book and read it. And that's one of the things that just makes Hubert Harrison so fascinating. Like even in the book, you talk about I guess I think one of his early librarians asked him, how, like nobody checked out more books than Hubert Harrison. He talked about reading 6 books in a day, and
Mhm,
I was
mhm.
just like, wow, man. But Dr. Brian Kwoba, man, this is amazing work, and
Thank you.
I
Before we stop, can I
mhm.
just share one more thing?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure.
Because I heard you starting to wrap it up a little bit there,
Hmm.
but I can't go without speaking at least a little bit to the chapter 6, which is called Black Free Love Politics and the
Yes.
Queer New Negro,
Hmm.
because among all the other things, Harrison was not just a black socialist and black internationalist and black free thinker. He was also a black free love figure, right? One of the, if not the first black figures in U.S. history to denounce church and state repression of sexuality, to give a public facing lecture series on sex education,
Hmm.
to call for the decriminalization of access to contraception, and to explicitly defend a love style based on variety and freedom as against the compulsory monogamy of the kind of puritanical Christian, ethos of the
Yeah.
culture, which said that the maximum number of romantic or sexual partners a person can have at any given time is one. Um, Harrison is not the only person, to refuse to limit his sexual or romantic life to one person at a time. You have the blues women, you have Alain Locke and Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes
Hmm.
and Claude McKay and, Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois and Amy Ashwood Garvey. But Harrison is articulating a highly studied politics of free love, right?
Hmm.
Drawing on influence from the European American sex radical tradition going back to the 19th century, drawing on African culture, the fact that, plural marriage, right, was existed in Africa and all other parts of the world. Um, he's drawing on Marxism, right? He's saying, look, the reason we have this regime of monogamy is so that the ruling class can know who to pass down their wealth to. The ruling
Yeah.
class men want to know who their quote unquote legitimate heirs are. And so they impose monogamy for women,
Hmm.
hypocritically for women only, so that they can transfer their wealth to the next generation. So Harrison, as part of the kind of radical milieu in New York, is learning from all these sources, right? He's drawing inspiration and he's developing a black free love politics that speaks to the fact that, as Jennifer Nash puts it, how can we imagine black political freedom without black sexual freedom, right? And what would it mean if we actually, took seriously what Harrison was doing, particularly in the context, right? When you have the church with its sex negative and puritanical morality that is, encouraging people to be ashamed of their
Yeah.
sexuality and sexual desire. When you have rampant state repression of sexuality, the Comstock laws of the late 1800s, which basically criminalized all manner of things sexual. Contraceptives were illegal, abortion was illegal, sex toys were illegal, extramarital sex was illegal, anal sex and oral sex were illegal, sex education pamphlets were illegal, erotica was illegal, paintings depicting too much skin were illegal, right?
Wow.
And the government persecuted people who were providing abortions or who were trying to circulate sex education pamphlets or who were writing novels that had sexual themes and erotic themes. And then, of course, you have the anti-black sexual repression of lynching, right?
Mm.
In which black men overwhelmingly were not only lynched roughly twice a week during Harrison's day, but lynched and often castrated as
Right.
well,
Right.
right? Which is a direct attack on black masculine erotic power and frankly on black personhood more generally. Not to mention the sexual assaults of black women domestics working in white homes, which was also rampant in the South. Yeah, the image of the Jezebel, the hypersexual black Jezebel,
Hmm.
or the desexualized mammy.
Mm.
So in a context of church repression of sexuality, state repression of sexuality, anti-black repression and distortion of sexuality, to come out as a black free lover in this context is almost unthinkably revolutionary given the risks involved,
Yeah.
right? Given that, black men were being lynched for the supposed sexual threat that they posed to
Right.
white women and white masculinity. This I think is, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think this chapter alone is worth the price of
Oh
admission, so
yeah.
to speak, because it opens up a whole new field for radical rethinking of some of the assumptions that no one has really leaned into, at least not in a sort of scholarly level, very much. I mean, even Black queer studies, for example, Black queer theory, they've done a lot of great work to interrogate, heteronormativity, to interrogate homophobia, right? But when it comes to compulsory monogamy,
Mm.
there's not so much systematic interrogation, even in a place where you would expect that people who are thinking critically about sex and sexuality would be or might be doing that work. And so I think this opens up a whole new conversation about what does it really mean to get free? Because if Ella
Yeah.
Baker and them, Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and them, if they were right when they said no one's going to get free until we all
We're
get
off.
free,
Right.
then we need to take much more seriously the ways in which, as Audre Lorde put it, the suppression of the erotic, not only the erotic power of women, but also the erotic power of black men who are being lynched and castrated every week. How does that relate to a broader system of oppression? And that, I think, is what is so powerful about what Harrison was able to do. Namely, he connected capitalism and white supremacy and Christianity and colonialism to compulsory monogamy,
Right.
right? That
Right.
it's all part of one, it's a package deal. They all go together and reinforce each other.
I think again, like how I mentioned before, just for the audience, because you know more than anyone, but when we say genius, it's not an exaggeration.
Mm,
To even be a visionary and be able to connect these dots in a time like that, where again, as we mentioned earlier, in some cases, we still haven't caught up to some of the
mm.
things
Yep.
that Hubert Harrison was trying to tell us. And that's why this work is extremely important. Whenever I read it, it was great ability to give the context of the time in which he was doing these things, but also how does it affect us now? Like where are we in this now, right? And
Mm, mm.
um
Yeah, we have.
well,
I
no,
was
even
just,
because I just wanted to say one thing.
yeah, yeah.
Even with his ideas of armed self-defense
Hmm.
before the Panthers, right? And
Yep,
if you don't mind, get into that a little bit because as you mentioned, we're talking about a time where there, what you said, two lynchings a week,
yep,
and he's like, look, you know, I support armed self-defense, and when just reading that, that's not a thing that academia likes to touch all the time. To be honest with you, um,
right.
colonized people don't have the right to defend themselves against violence,
Hmm.
against colonial violence.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he had other ideas about that. And
Hmm.
I'm,
Hmm.
that was something another thing that really struck me. If you don't mind, can you talk
Yeah.
about that some?
Sure, sure. Just say one last thing on the Black free love topic.
Mhm.
We do have now more than ever Black and poly communities, right? People thinking about ethical non-monogamy,
Yes.
about open relationships. So there is the beginning, I think, of us beginning to question some of the assumptions we have held. But this again, this is nothing new in the sense that folks back in the 1920s, like the blues women, for example, were singing songs about women's bodily autonomy, women's independence, women having same gender relationships, and also non-monogamous
Hmm.
relationships, which is part of the sexual experimentation that was going on during the so-called Harlem Renaissance, alongside all the artistic and creative experimentation
Mm.
that was going on. But yes, armed self-defense is something that Harrison it was not purely theoretical for Harrison. It was something he practiced, right? There's a moment where he's speaking uptown in Washington Heights, which at that time was an Irish Catholic neighborhood, and he's speaking on the subject of his critique of Christianity in the church, and the crowd up there didn't want to hear that, right?
Right.
Right? These Irish Catholics who are the kind of spiritual descendants of those Irish folks who perpetrated an anti-black massacre during the New York
Mm,
draft riots of 1863, they end up coming for Harrison, and Harrison ends up taking a table leg,
right.
right? Ripping off the leg of a table and physically defending himself from this lynch mob.
Hmm.
Harrison understood that black folks needed to employ armed self-defense to survive lynching because that's what he had to do to
Mm,
survive a lynching. And so it was a very practical question for him, and one that I think it's not unique to Harrison, right? There's a tradition
yeah.
of armed self-defense going back to, Harriet Tubman, and those folks. The abolitionist movement, were willing to use force to
Hmm.
free and defend self-liberated persons, what they called fugitive slaves. Um, and that tradition, would continue after, obviously, going up to the Panthers, as you mentioned, and beyond. But it's another aspect of Harrison's deep commitment to the dignity of Black people, his love for Black people, which was really extraordinary and something that, again, I think we can still learn quite a lot from.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, Dr. Brian Kwoba. Thank you. I mean, I could, don't get me wrong, we could keep, but I want
Uh-huh.
people to buy it. You know what I'm
Yes,
saying? Right,
yes,
right,
absolutely.
right.
So yeah, so on that note, if people want the book, I mean, first of all, you can check out my website, briankwoba.com, briankwoba.com. But if you want to order the book directly from the publisher, you can go to the UNC Press website. That's University of North Carolina Press. You just search Hubert Harrison or search Brian Kwoba. You will find the book. And you can use the code 01 social 30 to save 30% at checkout. That's 01 SOCIAL 30 to save 30% at checkout. Definitely check out the book. It's a labor of love. It's something that I've been working over a decade on, as I think I mentioned at the beginning of the show. And the last thing I want to say is that you're not, well, two things actually. One is you're not just buying a book, you're buying a piece of my heart and soul
Mm,
because I poured myself into this work. I think it's something that, it's bigger than just a book, right?
yeah.
This is the restoration of one of the greatest ancestors
Mhm.
of the Black radical tradition coming alive again in this book. And then the other thing I wanted to just say is I can't help but mention my favorite endorsement or review of the book from Robin D.G. Kelly, the very first blurb where he says, quote, Brian Kwoba has written a beautiful intellectual biography as radical and original as its subject.
Yes, yes,
And that just means so much to me because, I mean, we all know who Robin D.G. Kelly was, right? Author of, among other things, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination.
absolutely.
So for him to say that I've written a beautiful intellectual book as radical and original as its subject is it's not just anybody saying that, right? I mean, this is one of the titans of scholarship on the Black radical tradition, and so yeah, I'm grateful for his review and some others like it. And yeah, folks should definitely check out the book because I'm going to be hopefully coming soon to a theater near you. I have a whole book tour lined up,
Nice.
for the coming months and years.
Yeah,
So
the Sankofa, the Sankofa, your
mhm.
lecture at Sankofa, that was amazing.
Mm,
It
mm.
was very ceremonial as
Yep.
well.
Yep.
I loved it. And I don't want people to forget this as well, that um, w- we're not talking about somebody that has a lot written about them.
Hmm.
Like you are literally helping to bring to life
Hmm.
to a new generation
Yep.
somebody who already didn't have much written about him. Don't get me wrong,
Right.
we had the Perry work, but like you said, unless you are someone who is really just into this that manner of study where it's so meticulous because it
Hmm.
breaks it down by first half of his life in the in one book and the second half of his life on the second. Like
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
um
It's not written for the general audience. It's written for
no,
scholars. It's written for very specialist scholars who are willing to invest the time to read 1,200 pages, right?
but
Um,
even those scholars still have to extract that and then frame it within the context of the
hmm.
Black radical tradition, because that
Hmm.
itself, the Perry collection, don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing it,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
it's obviously it's great work, and we appreciate all the work that he did in just you- going through all of the records. But at the same time, this is rooted in the Black radical tradition, Black history,
Hmm.
the labor struggle,
Hmm. Hmm.
the class consciousness, race consciousness, all these things,
Hmm.
and you encapsulate that very well. And so,
Hmm.
to me, this is one of a kind when it comes to works on Hubert Harrison. And again, I just kind of wanted to reiterate that because I this is not a case where, hey, I want to, I want to read a book about Dr. King. Well, okay, there's hundreds, right?
Hundreds.
You know,
Yeah, yeah. Same,
this is
same, hmm
yeah.
same with Malcolm X, same
Hmm.
with, a lot of our figures. Yeah, I am only the second scholar after Perry to produce a book-length treatment of Harrison, right? You can find articles, pamphlets, shorter pieces if you're looking online. But in terms of book-length treatment of Harrison, I'm only the second person and the first Black and African scholar to produce a book on Harrison. So that's the other key difference between Perry, who, radical though he was, he has a kind of Irish American, angle of vision given his background, whereas I'm coming at this unapologetically
Hmm.
as a Black and an African person, and so that's another key difference that I think shapes how I analyze and interpret the meaning and significance of Hubert Henry Harrison.
Absolutely. Everybody, make sure you go out and get that right away. Great work. Dr. Brian Kwoba, thank you for coming to Wise Dome TV. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Rakeem. I hope we continue the conversation in the future.
Absolutely.